Hello, History 362. So this week, and probably into next week, given that we're going to have a little interruption due to our midterm, we're going to be talking about the Ptolemaic dynasty, the third of the three most powerful Hellenistic kingdoms. Now, as we saw earlier on, we talked about the Wars of the Successors. This dynasty really hunkers down early on. In that Ptolemy is named satrap of Egypt almost immediately after Alexander's death, and his family is going to rule Egypt all the way from 323 down to 31 BC, when the last of his descendants, Cleopatra VII, is defeated by Octavian, the Roman warlord. And then Egypt is annexed into the Roman Empire. Now, we've sort of seen how all three of these kingdoms are kind of different. The Macedonian kingdom is the kingdom of the Macedonians, ruled by an ethnic king. The Seleucid Empire is this vast, kind of centerless, multi-ethnic empire that is ruled by a diaspora of Greco-Macedonian settlers in polis and colonies, Katoikii. And finally, the Ptolemies fundamentally are hunkered down as occupiers on top of a traditional native kingdom, one traditional native kingdom, namely Egypt. Now, it's important to note, the Ptolemaic kingdom does not just include Egypt, even though without question, Egypt is the most fundamental territorial unit for the Ptolemies. But the Ptolemies also control the adjacent strip of North Africa, Cyrene, for a long time, until its conquest by Antiochus the Great. They control Coile Syria, so Egypt going out the Gaza Strip, what's now Israel, Palestine, and then Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains going down to the Jordan River Valley. So they control that, Coile Syria, an important holding. And they also control outposts across the Aegean, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through garrisons, sometimes through diplomacy. But the Ptolemies have holdings and interests all the way across the Aegean, up Asia Minor, and even into Thrace. So it has a real sort of Aegean, there's a real Aegean kind of scattering of Ptolemaic power that's actually quite important for how the Ptolemies interact with pure rivals. This is one reason why they have such a rivalry with Macedonia. It's not really over control of Egypt, it's over control of the Aegean, where the Ptolemies project quite a lot of power. But even so, even with this, you can take away Cyrene, you can take away Coile Syria, which Antiochus eventually does. You can take away even these various Egyptian holdings, many of which are indeed lost after the pact between the kings. Fundamentally, the core of Ptolemaic power and wealth is Egypt. And here we should return to the kind of peculiar ecology of Egypt, in that you have the Nile River Valley, which flows and then fans out into the Nile Delta. And that is really some of the best farmland anywhere in the Mediterranean. Just to kind of put things in perspective, in Italy, eventually Roman agronomists say, a good return on planting one seed of wheat in Italy is 8. You get 8 seeds of wheat, so a 1 to 8 seed to crop ratio. Some Roman agronomists say even in Italy you sometimes get less. You get 6 or even 4. Not a very big return. We're told that if you plant 1 seed of wheat in Egypt, your expected return, and of course obviously it would have varied, but is 72. So you get 72 times what your initial seed crop is. That's extraordinarily productive land. And of course, the reason it's productive is the Nile flood, because the Nile doesn't just irrigate the farmland that is adjacent to it and the farmland of the delta. It also floods annually, and when it floods, it deposits sediments that act as this miraculous fertilizer. Remember, we live in a world where our agriculture, even though most of us are relatively removed from it, is heavily driven by petrochemical fertilizer. which really is a huge multiplier of the fertility of any farmland. The ancient world, there's not a lot of fertilizer. For most parts of the ancient world, they're desperately using whatever they can. Ash, animal dung, human urine and feces also collected. But in Egypt, they have this miracle where the Nile flood doesn't just water the fields, it fertilizes them, which is one reason why we get these huge returns of wheat. You exhaust the soil, no problem. There's going to be another flood the next year. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't hardship in Egypt, because sometimes the floods don't happen, sometimes they come late, sometimes they don't flood enough, so there is the real possibility of a bad year. But still, the pulse of those floods makes this incredibly fertile farmland. Now, there's another advantage to the way Egypt is structured. Ordinarily, if you have a lot of just, a wide, huge plain of farmland, that's administratively annoying to have to deal with, because now you have to send a taxman across a lot of territory to every single farmstead to assess the property and tax the property and collect the taxes. And that has a certain administrative load if your farms are really spread out over a wide distance. But if you go to Egypt, you have the Nile. You have the land that's immediately irrigated by the Nile, sometimes both, including even in antiquity, artificially. And then once you get beyond that, you have desert. So that means all your farmers are concentrated next to the river. They have to be. That's where the good farmland is. The farmland that gets flooded is by definition close to the river. And that also means that all of your farmers are therefore congregated upon this natural superhighway that is the Nile, that you can send administrators up and down on boats, and all they have to do is hop off their boat, assess, tax, repeat this as many times as you need to. It's very, very convenient. All of your best agricultural land is clustered, again, right along your main communications thoroughfare. So it's a very, very easy farmland to administer. This is one reason why Egypt, going back to the Old Kingdom, really is one of the. It's not the first place to get agriculture, but it's one of the first just incredibly splendid civilizations, because it's simply so easy for the Bronze Age Egyptians to actually exploit the agricultural populations that live along the Nile. So this is critical as the tax base to the Ptolemies. As far as we can tell, the Ptolemies are deriving about as much revenue from Egypt alone as the Seleucids are from what had been the Achaemenid Empire. Indeed, we get a figure. Some dispute about how accurate it is, and it's given to us by a far, far distant source, Saint Jerome, writing in the late 4th, 5th century A.D. But Saint Jerome tells us, using, it seems, earlier histories, that in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, Ptolemy II, he is bringing in roughly 90 million drachmas. That is almost 15,000 talents of silver. A talent of silver is about nearly 60 pounds of silver. The exact weight of the talent varies a little bit depending on what standard you use. But suffice to say, this is an extraordinary amount of money. This is, again, we can debate whether the Seleucid king or the Ptolemaic king is the richest man in the world, but the Ptolemaic king probably is. And a great deal of this money, again, our best guess, maybe about 75%, comes from Egypt alone. So this means the Ptolemies, compared to their peers, particularly compared to those poor Macedonians, are fabulously wealthy. And this is actually going to shape certain aspects of imperial self-presentation. Indeed, we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the nature of Hellenistic kingship, but one aspect that comes to be celebrated. On one hand, these guys present themselves as warlords, and they rule over spear-won land, and they're just tough guys. They also, however, as they start to become established as rich guys, and the Ptolemies maybe are leading the charge in this regard, celebrate their consumption, celebrate their trufe, their luxury. And this is one thing that sort of sets them above not just the commons, but even other elites. The level of luxury and pleasure that they're able to enjoy is something that starts to become part of Ptolemaic, well, all Hellenistic kings, but particularly Ptolemaic kings' self-presentation. They like to celebrate how fantastically rich they are. Now, this also extends to levels of cultural patronage. Again, cultural patronage is part of all of the Hellenistic courts. So even in poor Macedonia, where the king just doesn't have all that much money, a king like Antigonus Gonatas makes sure that his court has philosophers and historians, and they are part of that kind of courtly culture. Antiochus the Great has poets. There are libraries in Pergamon and Antioch, although we don't quite know their size. But the Ptolemies, from an early point, go nuts for cultural patronage. And they even develop a facility, the Museon, and one kind of aspect of this is a library. And this library grows and grows. Supposedly an early figure involved in this library, interestingly enough, is Demetrius of Phaleron. You may remember when we talked about Athens under the early successors, Cassander, when he captures Athens, puts a philosopher in charge of Athens basically as a tyrant. And Demetrius of Phaleron rules Athens until he's finally deposed. And he needs somewhere to go, so he goes into exile and he comes to the court of Ptolemy and becomes an early kind of founding figure in this whole enterprise of the Museon and the Library of Alexandria. It may be worth saying a few cautious things about the Library of Alexandria. Back in my day, kids may no longer be doing this, but back in my day, there was this sort of thing you would post on. We didn't have Twitter or TikTok, but we had Facebook, and so people would post on Facebook. I'm such a nerd, and you can tell that I'm such a nerd because you non-nerds are worried about some trivial secular thing. I sit around lamenting what was lost when the Library of Alexandria burned down and all the books that were destroyed. Now, people posting this sort of annoying thing on Facebook were actually kind of buying into Ptolemaic propaganda, because eventually the Ptolemies will sort of claim that the Library of Alexandria, a by all accounts very large collection, encompassed all known books. And of course, those claims subsequently get exaggerated after the library is no longer in existence. Now, it is true that the collections of the Ptolemies seem to be quite impressive. And they make an effort to try to obtain copies of as many texts as possible. Sometimes even these efforts are royal strong-arming. So there's a story that the Ptolemies send to Athens. The Ptolemaic king sends to Athens and says, Athens maintains official copies of the kind of canonical playwrights, tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and can I, the Ptolemaic king, who, by the way, is an ally of Athens and helps protect you from those nasty Macedonians, so can I, as a token of the gratitude, get these copies, get these official scripts, so that I can make a copy and put these copies in the library? And so Athens says, sure, and sends the official scripts, and the Ptolemaic king has them copied, but he keeps the official scripts and sends the copies back to Athens. And now he has the kind of the complete works of all the tragedians. So it is an impressive collection. One thing that I should note, and this is actually a notable article by Roger Bagnall, there is no reason to think that the Library of Alexandria encompasses every ancient book ever written up to date, or that it's necessarily even a particularly comprehensive collection. We have some sort of evidence of the rough size of the complex, and Bagnall estimates that at most, maybe it could hold 40,000 papyrus scrolls. And obviously, books at this point do not look like a codex, what we think of as a book. A book is actually a papyrus scroll that's rolled up. And when you get to the end of the scroll, that's the end of the book, and you have to start afresh. 40,000, that's actually a very big, impressive collection, and probably represents a substantial amount of royal resources in both acquiring and copying and curating this collection. But even then, it's probably not every book ever written. It's not 1 million books, or so these big numbers get thrown around by the History Channel for how many books there were in the Library of Alexandria, and also any law. There are several fires in the Library of Alexandria. That's not why we don't have certain ancient texts, right? It's not like the Library of Alexandria probably ever had the only copy of anything. And the main reason that we lose texts in antiquity is at some point they just stopped getting copied. It could have survived the Library of Alexandria if a Byzantine monk in the 12th century doesn't copy it and it gets eaten by rats. That's why we lost it. That's my little riff on the Library of Alexandria. Suffice to say, while there are, the Macedonian king has a sort of personal library, there are public libraries in Pergamon and Antioch. This is an impressive library. It's a sign of the level of resources that the Ptolemies can lavish on the project of cultural patronage. And indeed, some of our most famous court poets, it's no surprise, they come out of the Ptolemaic court, the ones that survived Theocritus, and then Callimachus. Both of them are rolling in that good Ptolemaic money and producing poetry as a result. So the Ptolemies are very, very rich because, again, they have such an ecologically convenient tax base there in the Nile. So therefore, Egypt is without question the core of the Ptolemaic kingdom. This is kind of different, again, than the Seleucid Empire, where it's kind of hard to pin down what the core is. Maybe Syria, probably, but kings are always on the move. Ptolemaic kings tend to stay in Egypt, and they particularly tend to stay in what is unquestionably the Ptolemaic capital city, Alexandria. So this is the city that had been laid out by Alexander the Great as he was coming through Egypt. It subsequently is built up into a huge royal center. Its population at this point probably is approaching over 100, probably 200,000 people. So it's a very, very big city, prominent harbor, famous lighthouse. This is the seat of the kings, and also the necropolis of the kings, where the Ptolemaic kings are all buried surrounding the mummified corpse of Alexander the Great, who's at the center of this grand Ptolemaic royal necropolis. And these kings supposedly can still be seen in the Augustan age, when Augustus visits Alexander the Great and sees the corpse, and someone says to Augustus, do you want to see the other Ptolemies? And Augustus says, well, I came here to see a king, not a bunch of corpses. That's what he thinks of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which, incidentally, he's destroyed. So we have a clear, defined capital city, and then pretty much a clear, defined also core region, Egypt. Now, how is this core? Now, one thing that is notable is that we don't see, unlike in the Seleucid Empire, we see sort of mini cities. Antioch, Apamea, Seleucia, Pieria, Seleucia on the Tigris, and there's just tons of big Seleucid cities. Really, in Egypt, there's a few smaller cities, but really Alexandria is the city. Now and then other settlements of Greco-Macedonian supporters who had been soldiers and mercenaries of the early Ptolemies. They are settled, and again, in smaller communities, katoikia, in Egypt. Now, as with the Seleucids, the key to maintaining military control over Egypt is the settlement of soldiers. And this really creates also a divide that most of the Egyptian peasantry, and there's at this point probably about 3 million of them altogether. That's probably the rough estimate for the population of Egypt. They exist to toil on the soil and lose most of their agricultural productivity in rents and taxes. And so they are ruthlessly exploited. And they're exploited by the small population of, again, Greco-Macedonian clerics, men who have been given an estate, and the size of the estate varies. Usually cavalrymen are given more land than infantrymen. And that estate is given in exchange for military service when the king calls people up. By and large, clerics are not expected to be working the land themselves, dirt on their hands. It's the Egyptians who farm these estates, working as basically serfs on these estates. And even if Egyptians have their own land, they're paying extraordinary taxes on that land. So the granting of land, again, is a critical aspect of how the Ptolemies control, again, this kind of settler population, this cleric population. The cleric population, and again, our best guess for how many clerics there are, it depends, but maybe around 100,000 adult males. It's hard to say. And there have been different sort of numbers tossed around. But suffice to say, they're a tiny, tiny proportion compared to the 3 to 4 million peasants. So this is indeed a native society. And in a native society that has distinct cultural traditions and a distinct memory of political independence, that's dominated by a very, very narrow settler elite. And those settlers, those clerics, they serve in the Ptolemaic army, fighting as Macedonian-style heavy infantry, Macedonian-style heavy cavalry, and pretty good, actually, when we see them in action. But they also, this is actually a problem that the Ptolemies have. Those settlers, it's really dangerous for them to leave. So if, say, a Ptolemy, like Ptolemy III, wants to march off and fight Seleucus II, he's taking a huge risk, because if he takes all of his clerics, puts them in the army, marches them off to go fight in Mesopotamia, now who's keeping those Egyptians down? This is a constant problem that the Ptolemies have. And this may be one reason why the Ptolemies are a little less militarily aggressive. They are oftentimes more interested in pursuing foreign policy through proxies, by providing money rather than direct military support. It's actually really hard for them to leave Egypt with an army, because they need to keep those soldiers there, those clerics there, to basically keep the Egyptian peasants down. Now, because the Ptolemies also have a huge sort of fan of interests in the Aegean, they also invest in a very large navy. And of course, sometimes those investments maybe aren't the most prudent. The Ptolemies show a profound weakness for building excessively large warships, including supposedly a fantastic warship that has 40 banks of oars. We're still not quite sure how this works. It may actually have a kind of 2 catamarans that are joined together. But this is an improbably large warship. Remember, at the time, the standard warship, a quinquereme, has only 3 banks of oars. This is improbably, these ships are improbably large and improbably clunky, but building sort of outsized warships, gargantuan warships that people come to gawk at, is a sort of manifestation of, hey, look, we've got the money and we're spending it on big boats. This is sort of at least hints at the importance of naval power to the Ptolemies. Now, that being said, the Ptolemies, their luck on the sea is surprisingly mixed. They get, as we've already sort of seen, they get beaten by the Macedonians in the 250s. They have some successes against the Seleucids during the Third Syrian War, but it's sort of surprising. They put a huge amount of money into their navy, and yet it struggles to maintain, the Ptolemies struggle to maintain naval hegemony after around kind of 250 BC. That said, diplomacy also pays off. The one thing that helps the Ptolemies continue to project power into the Aegean is their close alliance with Rhodes, which also has an excellent navy. So this is just kind of an overview of some aspects of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Next time we'll talk a little bit about the dynastic politics, the complex dynastic politics of the Ptolemies, including maybe one of the most shocking aspects of the Ptolemaic dynasty, namely the practice of royal incest. So on that note, I'll see you soon.